would very much like to thank the Animals and Society Research Initiative for inviting me to contribute to your fantastic lecture series. And I'm very honored to be here with you and delighted to contribute. So thanks a lot for this invitation. I will try to share my screen. Great. Post-anthropocentric pedagogies, purposes, practices, and insights for higher education. This is the tentative title of a paper I'm working on. And there are two things I would like to say about the paper generally before we start. The first thing is that it is work in progress. So I very much look forward to the discussion that we will have afterwards. And I look forward to the comments and any criticism that you may have on my paper and the presentation. It would be very helpful for me to continue working on this. And the other issue is that this paper is geared toward higher education teachers in general, and not necessarily higher education teachers who are doing work on human-animal relations or animal ethics, but higher education teachers more in general. So I hope that the topic here today will sort of suit a diverse audience in higher education. So with these two issues, I will just say a few words also about my two books. Professor Decker kindly mentioned them, and both are dealing with human-animal relations in education from critical perspectives, critical theory, and continental philosophy. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how they actually look like, how the camera images look like. So, okay. Some background then to this specific paper that I'm working on. It is positioned in the larger field of higher education pedagogy. Higher education pedagogy is, as you may know, a research field in its own right. You can say it's a subfield to education studies. But in my experience, human-animal relations have been largely overlooked in this research field. Although there are many examples of, for instance, critical animal studies publications in the area of higher education pedagogy. So it's not like they're lacking, the works are lacking. But my experience is that these works are often published in what I call here niche venues. For instance, edited volumes or anthologies geared toward a specific audience or a readership, or local journals. So my concern is that this important scholarship may not easily reach a wider audience. So what my paper seeks to do here is to try to bring together and also make visible this emerging scholarship. And in a way also to start a conversation between the different positions that also we can see emerging in this area. So this is what I hope that I will be doing, and also continue the conversation with you here today. And another source of inspiration for this paper is Constance Russell and Reingard Spanring's editorial introduction to their special issue in the journal Environmental Education Research a few years ago, where they write as follows, and I quote, given the diverse sites and inspirations of critical animal-focused environmental education, it is no surprise that it and related work goes by various names. Whatever the label, it has far-reaching implications for education and its research. On the one hand, its critical band seeks to disrupt anthropocentrism and speciesism. On another, hoof or tentacle perhaps, it has constructive and reconstructive ambitions, encouraging us to recognize and attend to our coexistence with the modern human. So what Russell and Spandring are saying here is that they have provisionally identified like 2 strands in the environmental education research literature regarding education around animals. One critical strand seeking to disrupt anthropocentrism, and another, as they call it, a reconstructive strand, seeking to create new relations with animals. So what I thought when I read this is that, is it possible, is there space here for some knowledge development and knowledge contributions? Can we perhaps elaborate a little bit on these 2 strands, or are there other strands that might also be emerging and visible in the literature in this area? So I was curious about this, and this is also part of the paper's intention to elaborate a little bit, if possible, on these 2 strands. So from this sort of emerges my research problem. What could it mean to teach in higher education from vantage points that do not assume that human self-interest should be privileged at all times? And in order to proceed with this problem, I propose the concept of post-anthropocentric education, which is a little bit potentially problematic. I was thinking whether I should only talk about critical animal pedagogies here, because after all, this is where I position myself as a researcher and as a teacher in critical animal pedagogies. But then I thought that perhaps it would be good to sort of widen the perspective and invite more positions into this paper. So I proposed the concept of post-anthropocentric education in order to conceptualize the work that I was planning to do here. And this, of course, includes critical animal pedagogies, as well as other critical approaches to human-animal relations in education and the teaching of these relations. I want to emphasize here that we will meet a lot of teacher voices throughout the presentation and the paper as well. And these teachers, they do not necessarily identify as post-anthropocentric educators, because this is my concept. So they might identify very differently, and in a way I impose this concept onto them. So I would just want to mention this in order to make everybody aware that this is my concept and not the educators, but I have to conceptualize them somehow, what they are doing, the work that they are doing. But this is also something that we could discuss. This is a literature study. I've been reviewing literature in the area of higher education teaching related to human-animal relations, animal rights, animal liberation, and animal ethics. So I have not pursued any fieldwork in this case. I have not interviewed any teachers, but I have access to the narratives through their own research, where they have published their own experiences about their professional practices as higher education teachers. So it's a literature study. This is also important to be aware of. So from here unfolds my 3 research questions. First, what are the purposes of post-anthropocentric pedagogies, and according to the researchers' own narratives in their papers they have published? And second, how is the position of the teacher configured, and how do approaches to pedagogical practice emerge also in the literature? And again, when I speak about pedagogical practice in this talk, I don't claim that I have direct access to it, but we can only have access to the practice through the narratives of the teachers. So I want to emphasize this again, it's very important. So it's the teacher's own views and narratives about their practice that I'm referring to. And the third question is, what insights can be drawn for higher education pedagogy from the experiences of post-anthropocentric educators? Is there some knowledge that we can gain from these educators that might be beneficial for the field of higher education pedagogy in general? So these are my 3 research questions that I am exploring in this talk. My sample, a few words about this as well, consists of roughly 20 articles or book chapters. They are multidisciplinary. I have looked at quite a wide range of disciplines in this area. For instance, curriculum theory, veterinary education, environmental education, business education, philosophy, geography, sociology, and so on. These stories or experiences, they are not representative. They don't claim to be representative either of their fields, and this is also very important. For instance, if I refer to a work in veterinary education, this doesn't mean that this work is representative or claim to be representative for veterinary education teaching in general. I think these teachers, they represent only themselves, basically. So there is no claim to any representative extrapolations here. I also focus on research that has been published within the last 2 decades. And that is mainly because this is a period when posthumanist thinking started to gain some momentum, also in education studies research. And perhaps this is rather late as compared to other disciplines, I would argue. But also the so-called animal turn also began to emerge in some works in education studies during this period. So this is why I focused on the last 2 decades here. And finally, I focus on the experience of the teachers themselves, their own narratives about their practices as teachers, their professional practices as teachers in higher education, as I mentioned. So let's move on to my findings then. And I will structure this part after my 3 research questions. So it will be pretty straightforward in the organization. My first research question, as you recall, is the purposes of post-anthropocentric pedagogies. And if we think again about Russell and Spanring's quote that I read a few moments ago, they found 2 strands provisionally in the environmental education research literature related to the teaching of human-animal relations. I have found 3 strands that are also entangled with each other in different ways. And the first strand that relates to the purpose of post-anthropocentric pedagogies is how these pedagogies, as any pedagogies I would argue, how they act on the learner, how they do something or try to do something with the learner, how they work through the learner or intend to work through the learner in different ways on the students. And one example is to challenge ingrained beliefs and behaviors in students. One such example, obviously, is meat consumption. Beliefs and behaviors that relate to our habits, our life habits, relating to human-animal relations in society. And another issue is to work against animal exploitation and violence, which is also something that is important in much of this literature. So post-anthropocentric pedagogies should nurture this capacity in the students in different ways. And also, what follows from here is also to become more caring and change-oriented human beings that have a capacity to produce change in the world on behalf of animals and the situation of animals. So this is the first strand of the purposes of post-anthropocentric pedagogies that I found. The second one is the expectations on education. What are post-anthropocentric pedagogies actually able to achieve? And here we find an important idea that is very much sort of characteristic of a lot of literature in this area, and that is reflection and dialogue, which is viewed here not only as a teaching and learning approach, but actually also as a purpose in and of itself. For instance, one educator that I refer to in my paper, who teaches a course on animal rights, says that he doesn't expect all his students to actually embrace animal rights during or at the end of the course, but as long as the students are able to reflect critically on issues that might previously have been unreflected, issues related to human-animal relations in society. As long as this reflection and also a dialogue about these issues can be achieved, then that is fine. And here we can see also a sort of connection to Paulo Freire's thought about the theory of praxis. Because there's also an idea here about that if you want to achieve larger change in society, a change in societal structures regarding animals' situations, then we have to start with the individual learner and transform something within the individual student. And in this way, we will be able, hopefully, to achieve these much more ambitious goals, such as unlearning human supremacy or even overthrowing speciesist relations across society as such. So while reflection and dialogue appears as rather humble or modest aims or expectations on education, overthrowing speciesist relations in society is an enormous ambition for education. It's extremely important, course, and I would be the first person to emphasize its importance, but it's also an enormous thing to expect from education to achieve. But we can see the ideas of Paulo Freire actually resonating through these ideas, I think, and the way these goals can be achieved. So the third strand related to the purpose of post-anthropocentric pedagogies is a little bit more philosophical in its nature, and that is to expose the premises of education itself to critical scrutiny. And this entails a critique of education as a humanizing process. Because the way that the Western education system has produced the human throughout history, according to this literature, it has really caused so much harm to animals and excluded them from moral communities, the human moral community. So it has caused a lot of harm to animals. So for this reason, we have to go quite deep into the philosophy of education and start to question the premises of education itself. So it's an ontological level of critique, we might argue here. And Nathan Snaser puts it this way, and we quote here, we must learn to think of ourselves as something other than human, and we have to imagine an experiment with pedagogies that do not presuppose this human as their telos. So working with this in education is also something that is quite far-reaching and might also be challenging, I believe. But it is the third strand I found related to the purpose of post-anthropocentric pedagogies, and it's quite interesting, I think. Now, my second research question relates to the position of the teacher in post-anthropocentric education and also approaches to teaching practices. And here we find sort of very, let's say, classical, critical, pedagogical ideal of the teacher as a co-learner that has been really widespread in critical pedagogy and critical education theory generally. So this is also picked up to a large extent and seems quite important in this literature in post-anthropocentric pedagogies. So instead of what is in critique theory really is the hierarchies that we have in the education system, hierarchies between teachers and students. So these hierarchies are rejected by these educators, and instead what is sort of strived for here are communities of learning and communities of knowledge sharing that may extend also to what is called coalitions of praxis, where not only teachers and students are included as equals, but also the public, notably activists such as animal rights activists are invited, and even animals themselves may be part of the actual teaching and learning situation in different ways. And there are different ways of working with this. I will soon present to you what I find a very thought-provoking and intriguing example by Alice Miller, who writes beautifully about when she, in her course on animals and ethics, invites a former fighting dog named Fred, together with his rescuer, his rehabilitator, to her seminar room, her seminar space with the students, in order for her students to learn something from the animal and not only engage with theoretical materials. So in the beginning, when the students meet Fred, some of them are a bit cautious because, after all, Fred is a former fighting dog, and this is something that has to be respected, of course. So some students will be a bit cautious, but then after a while, you will notice in the quote shortly that something happens in this space. There is some kind of shift that takes place that we might attribute to Fred himself and what the relations he builds with the students in this room. So I will quote now from Miller's story here. As this ease shifted to curiosity, Fred slowed down and paused before each of the proffered hands, sometimes offering a lick, sometimes a sniff. Many students moved closer to him, encouraging interaction. The rescuer assured them they were helping Fred to learn that human hands were not always hurtful. Several students expressed interest in adopting Fred, whereupon the practical and unsentimental rescuer explained their responsibilities in adopting a rehabilitated fighting dog. The readings and the talk helped contextualize the sympathy students felt, while Fred provided the missing component, the animal body on whom suffering was so directly written, and about whom so much was being historicized, theorized, and pondered. So maybe you can also see this shift that is going on. Something is moving here in this situation with Fred and the students. Something which is quite interesting in terms of animal rights, but also in terms of teaching and learning generally. I would just mention one word of caution here, because when we bring animals physically into the classroom or into a seminar room, I think there is a risk involved. I'm not saying that this applies to Alice Miller's teaching, not at all. But if, generally speaking, there is always a risk that bringing animals into education may convey an instrumental view of animals that they are actually accessible to us for any purpose that we may have for using them, also for seemingly harmless purposes such as education and teaching and learning. So this may not always be to the benefit of the animal herself or himself. And again, I'm not saying that this applies to Alice Miller's practice here, quite the contrary, actually, but I just have to sort of mention this risk that is always involved when we work with animals and animal issues in education. Okay, I will have a reason to get back to Alice Miller shortly, but I will leave her practice for a while right now. So I would like to say a few words also about teacher responsibility in post-anthropocentric education and some interesting contrasting views that I have found in the literature regarding the teacher role. And so this is my first example. I have two. This is the first one. So Nadine Dolby, who is a professor in veterinary education faculty, she speaks about the grading system as something that she wants to challenge. And I guess all of us who are teaching in higher education or have taught at other levels in the education system, we know that at least some students will be motivated by the grading system, by the potential to achieve high grades. This is very important, obviously, for a lot of students. So what Dolby tries to do instead is to, as she says, support students in pushing beyond the objectives of achieving high grades. And she does this through her human-animal relations teaching in a course on animals, society, and education, where, for instance, she asks her students to, as part of a course, to spend 4 hours together with an animal that they have chosen themselves and try to see the world from this animal's perspective and then write about this experience. So with this kind of experiential education, as Dolby herself conceptualizes her teaching, she tries to show her students that learning is not only about the grading system to achieve high grades, it's also about something bigger, learning for life, if you will, learning to make a change in real life for animals, for instance. So she challenges some very entrenched ideas in education through her teaching. And this can also be said about another educator who I encountered in the literature, J.L. Schatz, who also engages the grading system, but radically differently than Nadine Dolby does. Schatz uses the grading as a tool in his education to actually challenge traditional ideas of what kind of knowledge is considered gradable at all in higher education. This is an interesting example. Schatz teaches a course on speciesism and non-human liberation. And what he does toward the end of the course, when the students are going to write a final paper, is that he invites his students to voluntarily commit themselves to going vegetarian or vegan for the remaining part of the semester. And they will get some credits for this as well. Although the extra credits they will get, as according to Schatz himself, amounts only to a very small percentage of the overall grade. So it's not really a big issue in terms of grading. But still, this teaching practice in Schatz's experience is extremely controversial among his teaching colleagues. So it has stirred up a lot of controversy. And that is very interesting, because the critique is that this is an unacceptable abuse of teacher authority, and that the teacher here, Schatz, he imposes his own values onto the students that he teaches. So of course this is controversial. And for instance, in Sweden, I think this would be unthinkable. It just wouldn't be possible to do this. But given this background, I think it's also interesting to take a look at how SHATS students actually experiences this invitation to go vegan, this exercise, if you will, in the course. And as SHATS describes it, the students' experiences of this exercise varies quite a lot. So some obviously concludes that they are not prepared to become completely vegetarian at this point in their life. So they just abstain from taking on this challenge. Whereas other students, they affirm a positive experience, saying that they want to continue buying animal-friendly products even after the semester has ended. And yet there are other students who choose to abstain from the extra credits, since they didn't want a reward for doing what they thought they should have done all along. So I think this range of student responses is interesting in itself. And another interesting issue with SHATS exercise here is that, why do we think it is so controversial? What are the assumptions about the relation between teaching and learning in higher education that are so disturbed by SHATS' example here? And what is actually at stake with this kind of approach? So this is something also that we could discuss, I believe. So I find two interesting contrasting views on post-anthropocentric teacher responsibilities regarding the grading system in higher education. My second example of interesting contrasts relating to teacher responsibility and the teacher role is this one. In critical education theory and critical pedagogy, generally, quite often the teacher is seen as a guide, some kind of guide for raising consciousness in the students, somebody who will support and empower others to achieve certain goals. And this is something that has been heavily critiqued, for instance, by post-structuralist scholars. Also, Elizabeth Ellsworth has written a famous article where she describes why this is problematic, this view on the teacher role in critical pedagogy. And then we have a contrasting view on the teacher role as well, which, for instance, the education philosopher Gert Biesta has talked about quite a lot. And that is the unpredictabilities in the education process that imposes the limitations on education that the teacher has to acknowledge in different ways. So according to Biesta, then, teaching is something that can't be controlled. There is an inherent indeterminacy and unpredictability in education, in the education process. Students, they come to our seminar rooms with diverse backgrounds and experiences and the baggage that we may not know very much about. Quite often we don't know actually who is it that we have in front of us, who is it that we are teaching. So we have no idea, given these diverse backgrounds of our students, and given the unpredictable nature also of human relationships and how they sort of unfold in the seminar space, we don't know how education will proceed. And there's never any straightforward relation between what is being taught and what is being learned by the students. Because we don't know what actually happens in the communication process. We don't know how students feel about our teaching, really. It's hard to predict, at least. We usually have no idea what they are picking up and what they will do with this knowledge in the short term or in the long term. So these are all factors that are very unpredictable, according to Biesta. So what can we do as a teacher then in this kind of unstable situation that is the pedagogical process? Well, we have to acknowledge these limitations and also embrace the unknown in the seminar room. And although Richard White, who teaches classes in critical animal geography, he doesn't refer directly to Biesta, but I can really see how White's experiences resonate very, very well with Biesta's thoughts here. Because Richard White talks about working with students, working in and out with what is at hand, basically, in the seminar room, and to embrace the unknown and to do the best we can, and also to, as a teacher, to actually immerse in the learning experience himself or herself, together with the students. So these are also two interesting, contrasting views on the teacher role in post-anthropocentric education that I thought was worth mentioning. I will also get back to Biesta a little bit toward the end of my talk. Now, let me return to Alice Miller for a moment. When we talked about challenging conventional ideas in education in relation to animal ethics and animal rights and anti-speciesism and the critique of anthropocentrism, this is something that may be controversial, as we saw in the example with J.L. Schatz's teaching. So somehow the teacher has to navigate here some kind of degree of freedom in higher education. But as Alice Miller puts it, this teacher's degree of freedom in the post-anthropocentric classroom is highly contingent on one's own position in the university hierarchy. To challenge conventions in education is always a bigger risk for some teachers than others. And what Miller talks about here is if you are a teacher finding yourself in a sort of marginalized position in the university hierarchy, if you identify as a woman teacher, if you are a racialized subject and a teacher, if you identify as queer or non-binary or anything else that puts you in a sort of marginal position, you may face bigger obstacles in the seminar space than other teachers do. And I think this is very, very important to keep in mind. Because risk-taking in education is not, or the consequences of risk-taking may not be equally distributed among all teachers. It depends on your own position and other issues as well, I would say. So this is something to be mindful of, I think, that Alice Miller reminds us about. Now, my third research question is also a provisional conclusion. What can be learned from post-anthropocentric educators? Is there some kind of knowledge that we may gain from these colleagues that might be beneficial for higher education in general? And to summarize a little bit of my own experiences from this research, I think that post-anthropocentric education emerges as a rather diverse and also sometimes a contested terrain in the university pedagogy landscape. There are a range of different positions. Some are definitely overlapping, while some might also be diverging from each other and also perhaps even being in conflict in some sense. There are also multiple purposes appearing in this literature, from rather modest aims to encourage students to reflect on issues that might previously have passed by unreflected, especially relating to human-animal relations in society, to more far-reaching and radical objectives, such as overturning the entire species system in which we live, and in which education also is situated and reproduces in different ways. There are also several sometimes contradictory views on the role of the teacher and the responsibility of the higher education teacher, as we have seen. But still, despite this messiness, if we will, this complicated picture that emerges from this research, there seems to be at least three aspects or three dimensions that the educators in this paper seem to share. And interestingly, these three aspects also have support in the higher education pedagogy literature. And the first issue, obviously, is the deep passion and commitment to the subject matter that many post-anthropocentric teachers really seem to have and seem to accommodate and embody in different ways. And also a deep passion to critical inquiry as such. This is also mentioned by Noel Entwistle in his book in higher education, teaching and learning, where he says that if the teacher has a deep passion and an engagement with his or her topic that she teaches, this creates very beneficial conditions for student learning, because passion is contagious. And if students experience a committed and engaged and passionate teacher, they might be also inspired and encouraged to want to explore the issues by themselves. So this is something to keep in mind that we can actually take away from these post-anthropocentric educators. The other issue that seemed to unite these teachers is that they really invent a lot of innovative, creative, interesting ways of connecting theoretical materials to practice, to students' everyday lives outside the university. So what these teachers do is that they refuse to see academia and activism as separate spheres. They try to connect them. They build bridges between these two sectors. And this is also supported by the research literature, actually. I'm not sure if you have, if you're familiar with the article by Gardner and others that I mentioned also in my paper, but if you haven't, it's an article on academic activism, really. It's a fascinating article, and it really, really supports this dimension that seems to unite the post-anthropocentric teachers here. So a very inspiring article that I really recommend. The third aspect that seem to be in common between these teachers is that they also engage and also embrace risk-taking in education in different ways. We have seen examples of this, and we have also seen some problems that could be embedded here. I want to refer here again to Piesta, because he has written quite extensively on what he calls the beautiful risk of education. And when he talks about the beautiful risk of education, he doesn't mean risk connected to a specific subject matter, such as speciesism or veganism or animal rights or animal liberation. That is not what he's talking about. He's talking about risk as something that is inherent in education itself, in the educational process. And that has to do with also this indeterminacy and the unpredictability of the pedagogical process, as we talked about a few moments ago. So there's no way of escaping risk in education, really. And perhaps it's not even possible to talk about education without also acknowledging the risk that is inherent in this teaching and learning activities. So what post-anthropocentric educators perhaps can help us with is to to learn how to engage and also embrace this risk-taking and perhaps discuss it also in different fora in higher education. So these are basically my conclusions then. This is what I had to say in this on this paper, in this talk. I would like to thank you very, very much for your attention. And I very much look forward now to our discussion. I have proposed here a few questions that are sort of related to my own work with revisioning the paper. So what I would be curious about to hear from you is if these findings that I have presented, if they are meaningful at all for higher education teachers, do they resonate with you? Are the examples from teaching practices that I have presented here, are they clarifying enough? Are they engaging enough? And importantly, is there anything in this paper that can or should be deleted? Because I will certainly have to cut down the paper, I assume. So it would be wonderful to get your views about this. But of course, I would be very happy to invite any other comments and criticism that you may have, and interventions or questions, whatever. It's all warmly invited. So again, thank you so very much. And I will stop here and leave the floor to somebody else to continue the discussion right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedersen, for that wonderful presentation. Well, certainly we can begin with your discussion questions or a specific question from anyone who would like to post it now. But my own sense it may respond most to the second point there on the last slide. One thing I feel like it may just be like, what is the kind of correct term in English for what you are referring to, but the second part of the paper is on the position of the teacher. And so when I hear the word position, I think more about, I guess, in like the North American space of the social position or social location of the teacher, what you spoke about with respect to risk-taking in higher education and how some are differently situated than others, how we're all differently situated. But I feel like, the examples and the discussion is really like what you're focusing on there is the role or responsibility even of the teacher in the classroom. Is that correct? And perhaps then to just maybe consider changing the title of that section, or just to clarify, that's what you mean by position.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. It is a bit vague, I guess, this particular concept. So that's very helpful. Okay, so we have a question that's come in from the audience. So the question is, and the comment is, thank you for a very interesting lecture and preview paper, which I really enjoyed and look forward to its publication. A question which is not direct to, but complementary to your paper relates to how scholars working in critical animal studies, both in education, but also other disciplines, can connect with other educators who are promoting a post-anthropocentric classroom. Might you be able to suggest global networks for scholars to be able to share with those educators any resources being developed that support animal-centered education, such as documentaries, teaching resources, for example? So I think here we're seeing, I think the question is posing, identifying the distinction between a post-anthropocentric classroom and those who might be bringing in some insights there in their classroom, and those who are really kind of situated as you are in a critical animal studies paradigm. So again, the question is asking, might you be able to suggest global networks for scholars, if there are any, to be able to share with those educators, and any other resources, perhaps right in the paper? Right, thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one, and I'm not aware of any global network specifically targeting education. Of course, there are critical animal studies networks, And usually education studies is a quite small sort of area or part of this larger critical animal studies field. So it usually gets sort of, swallowed up by the larger networks, I think. But we have been trying also in the network at University of Gothenburg, which I sort of co-founded, to try to bring together colleagues who are engaged with teaching animal-related issues in education. So we don't yet have a sort of formalized network that I can sort of present here, but there are at least attempts to try to connect, because I think the number of educators here is actually increasing, because we see also new doctoral dissertations, for instance, coming where the topic relates to critical animal pedagogies in some way or the other, or post-anthropocentric education, teaching and learning in animal ethics and animal-related areas. So I think this is something really that we should try to formalize. And if anybody else here is aware of any network, I will be happy to sort of, join that as well. And I think also the same goes for materials, really. There is no platform, as far as I know, for sharing materials in higher education pedagogy related to human-animal relations. Usually the area of early childhood education has been much more active in this field. So there have been some networks and some platforms for knowledge sharing and sharing materials there. For instance, the Institute for Humane Education has worked in this way. So there are resources there, but not as far as I know that relates to higher education.
Thank you. So we have a few questions that have been posted to everyone. So let me read Liz's question, which first says, thank you. Many of the examples mentioned in your talk today were of classes that centered on speciesism or animal studies, suggesting many of the students were already engaged in challenging perspectives. Were there reflections on pedagogy with a more generic student population?
Yeah, I think so. I think the examples that I have brought up, they are quite diverse. I think in some courses, there are definitely students who are already somehow engaged with animals, such as in veterinary education faculty that I mentioned. But there are also obviously students who are not. And that might take courses in social justice issues, for instance, where the teacher will include human-animal relations in different ways and these intersectional perspectives on animals. So I think there are both ways, and perhaps we can also see from my example of J.L. Schatz. Obviously, all his students are not vegetarian or vegan from the start, but he offers this exercise where he invites students to try to go vegan or vegetarian as part of the course. And obviously this is something that not all students are sort of, already have done, but it's new to them. So I think there is a diversity here for different backgrounds and experiences.
Sure. Another question that's come in from Carrie. Hey, Helena, I'm so glad you're working on this. Can you speak to how we in critical animal studies can encourage or facilitate critical yet anthropocentric scholars, many of our colleagues at our universities across most departments, to see the value in incorporating non-human animals and the more than human world in their critical pedagogy, not seeing it as competing with or challenging their human justice oriented perspectives, but in complementing this as part of interspecies justice?
Right, this is a tricky issue, I think. because usually it can be quite hard in my own experience as well to create space for these issues, and it can also be quite controversial among colleagues, which I also have personally experienced and written about elsewhere. So it is a very good question. I think a quite common answer to this question is to, or a common sort of strategy, if you will, is to try to engage this kind of intersectional approach on human-animal relations, where you may want to show as a teacher how different forms of oppression are tangled up with each other, and even support each other and confirm each other in different ways. So if this kind of approach can be sort of incorporated, I think that might make it easier for colleagues to see the value of animal issues. And I talk about it as a strategy because somehow I think if you look really critically at this, somehow what we do is to also somehow legitimize the introduction of animal human relations in a sort of anthropocentric fashion as well, while doing this, to motivate our inclusion of animals by the benefits to humans again. But still, I think it's something that is worth considering, and it's also one of the things that opened my own eyes to animal issue at a deeper level. So it might be worth trying, actually.
Thank you, Helena. And Kishore writes, what sort of changes are required in school education curricula to accomplish your aims in higher education?
The curriculum.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would assume it's of that higher education curriculum.
How does this has to change in order to sort of achieve an awareness of human-animal relations?
Yes, perhaps, if it was up to you to change things going on at Gothenburg, what one or two things do you think would make a real impact, if I can take interpretive license with Kishore's question? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about the curriculum, it is extremely tricky, I think, because there are so many things that need to go in there. So, and it's such a political sort of document, if you will. So I think this is very hard to actually change. And I think it requires perhaps some long time work in order to work on curricular changes. So, but actually, I have a colleague in Finland, Maria Sari, who has written her PhD dissertation exactly on educational policy and animals. So I would rather sort of refer to her works because she's the expert on this, and I'm not really. So I can really recommend her thesis, which is really interesting. It's University of Oulu in Finland. But her thesis also speaks to the fact that it is a very political area to go into curriculum theory, for instance. So, and how to instigate change in the curriculum. So there are plenty of challenges here. And requires a lot of effort.
Well, the last few questions just, have made me think, like, to what extent with the sample for the paper, was there any emphasis on what I have heard in other contexts, not being an education scholar myself, but of course, having to teach and trying to kind of know something about higher education because of the responsibility, that most of the, I often hear people saying most of the learning happens outside the classroom, right? So the teacher can only do so much with the time that you have, and most of what students will learn, you're just a guide and like curating some information and then presenting in a certain way or interacting for a limited time, but most of the learning is outside. And then I think of, like, especially with respect to like a critical animal studies approach to the university and most of the learning being outside, have you thought, Helen, about, well, the first question is, have any of those in the sample set basically said most of the learning is always going to be outside, and thus, you know, we need an embodied experience of education. So that would be like a first issue to that. But then a secondary issue, at least in some campuses, we see or in some countries, we see on campus kind of a movement really not about the curriculum, but about the catering, right? And about what is being served on campus in terms of, you know, the experience of farmed animals or animals in the intensive farming and other farming industries. So that there's messaging about that to some extent, or at least controversy or some attention. And I wonder if there's space in this article. I know that you said you had to cut it down, but to draw the parameters perhaps more tightly around that. This is about education in like the seminar context, right? Or that's probably already implicit, but is it worth saying in a footnote something about the other kind of initiatives that are happening in higher education? Perhaps let's say more than in elementary education or middle school education around, although it is happening in some schools, changing the food program.
Right. Yes, this is also quite a big problem, I think, that you're pointing to here. And yes, regarding the first question that you had about learning happening outside the classroom, perhaps most of the learning happening outside the classroom or the seminar room, I think that is correct in a way. I think what you can do as a teacher is basically to try to create conditions for learning to take place, to create the conditions that are conducive to learning. So I think that is the most you can do actually with your teaching time, but that is very, very important also. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of this, you know, curating, as you put it, learning or creating conditions for it to happen. And I think we've seen also many examples of this. And I also think regarding this outside the formal education, outside the seminar space or outside the university space, what is happening. I think there are plenty of teachers who try to work in that way. For instance, Nadine Dolby, who asks the students to go out and actually meet real animals and spend time with them, and try to put themselves in the animal situation and experience what they are experiencing and so on and so forth. So this kind of embodied learning or experiential learning that she talks about also has, of course, support in a lot of research literature. But I think that is a good example of how you can work with it. And then the food issue, yes, I think, you know, school food and campus food is actually sort of beginning to become almost a research subfield in itself. There is a body of research that is sort of beginning to address these issues. There are anthologies and research papers and so on and so forth. So I think there is, the good thing about it is that there seems to be at least some kind of raising awareness that this is a problem for so many different reasons, sustainability reasons and ethical reasons and anti-capitalism and what have you. So this is something we have to, I mean, school food is part of education. I think this is the key message here in this kind of discourse. So we can't just focus on education, what is happening in the seminar room, and then just ignore, you know, the catering or the food that is sort of available to students, that we make available to students. So there is actually quite interesting research on this issue. And regarding sort of practical initiatives or activism, yes, I think there is. I don't think I can point to any concrete examples, but at least there are research papers who try to conceptualize this in also in practice-based approaches, if that makes sense. So yes, there are such initiatives.
Thank you. So we have a few questions, and Helen, I'll just kind of read them all together, just given our limited time now, and then maybe perhaps invite you to respond as you would like here. So the first question from Nargis is, do you consider literary human-animal studies as post-anthropocentric pedagogy? Have you looked into the potential of this field for cessation of animal oppression and change? A second question from Kishore, how to make society and political parties receptive to your ideas on education. And then Jody writes, thank you so much for this talk. It encapsulates my experience teaching critical animal studies over the last 15 years and is really needed. I'm interested in the role or position of the teacher, since advocacy for animals is not legitimized by the university itself and can in fact be quite hostile, if not dismissive and reductionist. This is why I like post-anthropocentric pedagogies, because it brings us into intersectional territory where one can see how animalization is germane to other social justice issues. I'd wonder if you'd include research regarding the meaning, the premises of education, as these affect those situated as teachers.
Yes, okay. There are lots of questions there. See if I can remember them. Otherwise, you'll have to support me, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, the first question was about literary human-animal studies, right?
Sorry.
Was that so?
Yes.
Correct. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. Yes, definitely. I think this definitely has its place in human-animal education. And we have, of course, we have this educational concept called literacy. And I think this literacy concept is also expanding in all kinds of different directions. So we have eco-literacy, for instance. And I think there is no reason why we shouldn't include, animal literacy, if you will, in this concept as well. And I think we should do that, and that might have connections with literary human-animal studies as well, as a sort of approach to education. So, yeah, the response to that is definitely yes, it is very important. And I think we have John Drew with us today. I think I saw that. So because John has written his thesis on literary studies and animal ethics and critical animal studies. So we have another expert here we might want to consult in this matter. And then I'm sorry, I do think I missed the point perhaps of the second question. It was a little bit quick. It was on political parties. Was that correct?
Yes, the second question, Helena, was just about how to make society and political parties receptive to your ideas on education. And then the third question about, universities being quite hostile, if not dismissive and reductionist. This is perhaps why the post-anthropocentric paradigm versus the critical animal studies paradigm might be more productive.
Yeah, I mean, these are really tricky questions, I think. I don't know how to make society at large receptive to these ideas and the importance of these ideas. I think one important way to do so is to show how important human-animal relations are for sustainability and the environmental crisis. Because animals are both affected by ecological crisis as well as also the way we treat them is a cause, as we know, for environmental disaster. So I think this is, and there are also PhD dissertations in progress on these issues, specifically in education. So I think this is a very important way. Again, it might come across as sort of, again, motivating animal issues or attention to animal issues through something else, in this case, sustainability, which is a problematic concept on its own, right? But still, I think there is a point there, and it is important, although I must say that there are also scholars, colleagues who are cautious against incorporating animal issues in sustainability, larger sustainability frameworks. For instance, Professor Nouri Almiron in Spain would have a problem with this. So there are different views here. So we might want to be a bit careful when we do this. But it might be a strategic thing that may or may not work, but also important in its own right, if we keep our critical stance also toward this and are careful with what we are doing. And then we had the role of the teacher and the premises of the teacher in higher education, which can face challenges, right, as being dismissed. So how to work with that? Yeah, I think that goes back to perhaps the first question that we had, how can we sort of create these collegial networks and supportive sort of platforms for ourselves and our colleagues who are interested in post-anthropocentric pedagogies. I think that is extremely important to sort of realize that you are, even if you feel alone in your work, you are not, because there are other people out there, other colleagues who you might want to reach out to and try to invite each other and try to sort of do work together and perhaps co-develop a course or whatever you can think about, apply for funding or something. I think that would be a way to actually show higher education that there are many of us and our work is very significant. Was that an answer to the last question? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedersen, for all those insights. And really, we're just out of time here, so it's an appropriate moment to close. There are some nice links for everyone in the chat that some have put in terms of other resources and scholars you mentioned to follow. So, you know, both the paper and the presentation are really appreciated, both because, you know, it's wonderful to have someone of your stature come and give us a discussion on education of critical animal studies. And you mentioned several times the dissertations that are coming up. And I think that is at least one positive effect of what we have seen, as hard as it is, in terms of kind of a generation of scholars like yourself and others here that have been doing this work. And now we see kind of it being carried forward by others into newer generations. And also I appreciate the close and careful synthesis that you're doing in distilling kind of all these disparate sources and bringing it together to present the themes. And I really want to thank you for that contribution, in addition to all the other work you have done. I also would like to thank all of you, our audience members, for being with us here today, as well as the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for the funding for this lecture series, as well as our co-sponsor today, the Center for Global Studies, for supporting this talk. And I just wanted to do one brief kind of call out or note, not call out or shout out, and note that in continuing the theme of humane education, I'm really pleased to announce to everyone the public launch today of our open access scholarly documentary film pilot on animal law. This 38-minute film surveys the current field of animal law and policy through the eyes of 4 youth active in animal advocacy. It's produced for global viewers and particularly audiences in secondary and post post-secondary education. The film reveals the inadequate status of animals under the law and those working to improve towards more ethical laws. It includes interviews with leading global animal law scholars and practitioners and legislators working to advance animal protection. And hopefully it is a pilot for a 6-episode series to follow in the next year or two. So you can watch the film for free on our website at animal-law-films.uvic.ca, as well as on YouTube and Vimeo. And Holly will be posting those links in the chat now. Next up in our Distinguished Lecture Series on January 17th, 2023, is Canada Research Chair Dr. Margaret Robinson, also Assistant Professor at the Departments of English, Sociology, and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University, presenting under the title Animal-Centric Storytelling in Mi'kmaq Social Research. And of course, as always, you can pre-register for that online event through our website, following the link at the top of the chat. Again, Dr. Pedersen, thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you kick off our academic year lecture series. And thank you again for everyone joining us today. Stay well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for everybody joining and for the invitation again. Thanks a lot, and hope to see you again at some point.
Yes,
please get in touch if you want to speak with me further. I would love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pedersen, especially for staying up so late. Thank you.
It's no problem. It's a bit dark over here in Sweden this time. Yeah, so sorry about that.
That's okay. A lot of congratulations and thank yous in the chat for you.
Thank you so much, everybody.